The CEO invited me to lunch and smiled like nothing in my life was about to break. He said, "We think it's time to bring in fresh energy." And in that single sentence, 8 years of my work were quietly erased. Then he mentioned his nephew, Ethan Caldwell, a man who had never built anything in our tech system, yet was suddenly being positioned to replace me. I remember the sound of the restaurant fading, like the world itself was stepping back to watch what I would do next. And all I said was, "I understand," with a calmness that made him think I had accepted my own replacement. Before we continue, if this story speaks to your heart or reminds you of a moment you were underestimated or pushed aside, take a second to like and subscribe. It truly helps more stories like this reach people who need them. And I'd love to know where you're watching from, so drop your city or country in the comments and what time it is for you right now. Because somehow stories like this feel different depending on where in the world you are listening from. My name is Olivia Harper. I'm 34 years old. And what happened in that lunch meeting was the moment everything I believed about loyalty, work, and belonging inside a company quietly collapsed. But to understand why that moment cut so deep, you have to understand what came before it. The CEO, Richard Caldwell, had personally invited me to that lunch at a quiet downtown Chicago restaurant with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river. I thought it was a performance review, maybe even a recognition of the system I had spent nearly a decade building from scratch. Instead, he sat across from me, folded his hands, and said in a tone so polite it almost felt rehearsed, "Olivia, you've done incredible work, but the company is evolving. We need to give opportunities to new people." I remember pausing, holding my glass of water just a little too tightly, and asking, "New people?" even though I already knew what was coming. That was when he leaned back slightly and mentioned Ethan Caldwell, his nephew, like it was the most natural transition in the world. "He brings a fresh perspective," Richard said, "and I think it's time for you to step into something less operational." Less operational. That was the phrase he used for the system I designed, the architecture I built, the infrastructure that kept the entire company running day and night without failure. I looked at him for a long moment and said nothing at first, because I needed to understand if this was ignorance or decision. Ethan wasn't just inexperienced. He had never once participated in the core deployment systems, never debugged a production failure at 2 a.m., never held responsibility when millions of dollars of operations depended on a single line of code functioning correctly. And yet he was the one being handed the future. "I understand," I finally said, and I meant it in a way he clearly misunderstood. He smiled, relieved, like the hardest part was over. But what he didn't see was the shift happening inside me. Not anger, not panic, but calculation. Because I didn't just work inside Caldwell Systems, I was the reason it functioned at all. Every routing process, every operational workflow, every silent automation that kept the company stable had passed through systems I personally designed and maintained. And I had never told them how deeply that dependency ran. When I left the restaurant that day, the Chicago wind felt colder than usual, cutting through my coat as I stood on the sidewalk watching traffic move like nothing had changed. But everything had. Over the next few days, subtle things started shifting at the office. My access to internal dashboards was reduced without explanation. My name quietly disappeared from leadership documents. In meetings, Ethan began sitting in my usual seat, smiling too confidently, repeating terms I knew he didn't fully understand. HR started referring to transition planning whenever I asked questions. Sarah Bennett from HR even said to me once, almost sympathetically, "You should think of this as growth, Olivia. Sometimes people outgrow their roles." I remember nodding at her because arguing would have changed nothing at that point. But what they didn't realize was that every system they were now touching, adjusting, or transitioning was connected to layers they didn't even know existed. And I had built those layers in silence. Late that night, I stayed in the office long after everyone left, watching system logs scroll across multiple monitors. Ethan had already started making improvements, small changes he proudly announced in Slack channels I could still read but no longer influence. The changes were wrong. Not dramatically wrong at first, just slightly misaligned, like a foundation being shifted 1 inch at a time, where no one notices until the building starts to lean. I didn't correct anything. I just watched. Because now I needed to understand how far they were willing to go without me. And somewhere in that quiet observation, I realized something they hadn't considered at all. They didn't just replace an employee, they replaced the person holding the structure together. And the strange part was, no one had asked what would happen if that person simply stopped holding it. But what they didn't know yet was that I never stopped holding it in the first place. And the real system, the one they depended on without even realizing, was still running entirely through me. The change at the company did not feel sudden to me when it happened. It felt familiar. That was the strange part, the part I did not understand until much later. It was the same quiet rewriting of my presence that I had lived with long before I ever stepped into Caldwell's systems. Years earlier, before any of this corporate structure or technical architecture existed in my life, I had already learned what it meant to be present but not truly seen. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood outside Seattle, in a house that always looked normal from the outside. Beige siding, trimmed lawn, a mailbox that always leaned slightly to the left. My father, Michael Harper, worked in logistics for a shipping company, and my mother, Diane Harper, worked part-time at a dental office. I had one younger brother, Jason, who somehow always managed to be the center of every conversation without trying. I learned early that attention was not distributed equally in our home. It was assigned, and I was never the priority assignment. I still remember one night at the kitchen table when I was 13 years old. My school had sent home a letter saying I had been selected for an advanced technology program. I placed the paper carefully in front of my parents, my hands shaking slightly with hope. "This is a special program," I said. "It starts next semester. I just need permission and the registration fee." My father glanced at it, barely reading the first line before leaning back in his chair. "That sounds expensive," he said. My mother did not even look up from her phone. "Jason has soccer tournaments that season," she added. I remember blinking at her, confused. "This is after school," I said. "It will not interfere with anything." My father exhaled like the conversation itself was inconvenient. "Olivia, we cannot put everything into every opportunity. Be realistic." Jason walked into the kitchen at that moment, spinning a soccer ball on his finger. "What is she talking about?" he asked. My mother smiled immediately, that automatic smile she always gave him. "Just school stuff," she said. Then she turned to me. "You will understand when you are older." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else in that moment. Not because it made sense, but because it did not. I remember taking the letter back to my room, folding it twice, and placing it inside a drawer I rarely opened. That night I told myself it was fine, that I did not need it, that I would find another way. Years later, I would realize that this was the first system I ever learned to navigate. Effort did not guarantee recognition. At school, things were no different. Teachers liked Jason because he was outgoing, loud, easy to notice. I was the student who submitted assignments early, stayed late in the lab, fixed group projects when others gave up. But when awards were given out, Jason was the one whose name got called for team spirit in sports events I never attended. I remember once in high school, I built a small software tool for a science fair project, something simple but functional, designed to simulate traffic flow in small cities. My teacher looked at it, nodded politely, and said, "This is impressive for a side project, Olivia. Maybe you can help Jason with his presentation instead." Jason's project that year was a cardboard volcano. I still helped him rehearse. That was expected. At home, my room was the smallest in the house. A twin bed, a desk, a single window that faced the neighbor's fence. Jason's room, even though he was younger, was larger because he needed space to grow. I never questioned it out loud. You learn not to question things when questioning does not change outcomes. Instead, I built things quietly. I learned programming from borrowed library books. I stayed up late on an old laptop that overheated after 20 minutes of use. I solved problems that no one asked me to solve. And when I finally left for college, I did not tell my parents I had received a partial scholarship based on technical merit. I simply said I would be attending state university and paying my own way. My father nodded once and said, "Good. That is practical." That word again, practical, as if it was a personality category instead of a limitation they placed on me. At university, everything shifted, not because people suddenly saw me differently, but because I stopped asking to be seen at all. I stayed in labs longer than anyone else. I worked on systems architecture when others were going out. I stopped explaining my work in simple terms. I just built. That was where I met technology in its real form, not as a tool for recognition, but as a structure that either functioned or failed. There was no emotional interpretation, only logic. That clarity became my refuge. Years later, when I joined Caldwell Systems, it felt almost identical to those early days in my family home, except now the scale was larger and the consequences more visible. At first, no one really noticed me there either. I was just another engineer, another name in a long list of contributors. That invisibility was comfortable because I already understood how to operate inside it. What I built over time was not just software systems, but entire operational frameworks that became the backbone of the company. And just like before, recognition never came with responsibility. Responsibilities simply accumulated on me without announcement. I remember one conversation with Daniel Moore, the chief technology officer, late one evening in the office when most floors were empty. He looked at a system dashboard I had rebuilt and said quietly, "If this ever fails, everything fails." I asked him, "Do they know that?" He hesitated before answering. "They know the system works," he said. "That is enough for them." I remember looking at the screen for a long time after he left, because I understood something in that moment that I had understood many times before in my life. Being essential and being valued were not the same thing. And at Caldwell Systems, just like in my childhood home, those who depended on me did not necessarily see me. They simply used what I built. I should have known that invisibility always comes with a cost, but I did not fully understand how high that cost would become until the first signs of replacement began to appear, quietly, almost politely, as if I had simply become optional instead of essential. And that was when I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Everything started to shift the day I stopped trying to stay invisible in rooms where I was already essential. It did not begin with a dramatic announcement or a sudden confrontation. It began with something far more dangerous in corporate environments: recognition without understanding. I was called into a leadership sync on a Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock sharp in Conference Room 7, a glass-walled space overlooking downtown Chicago where everyone pretended transparency meant honesty. Richard Caldwell was already seated at the head of the table, flipping through printed reports like he was reviewing someone else's life. Ethan Caldwell sat to his right, relaxed in a way that only comes from not knowing what you do not know. Sarah Bennett from HR was there as well, tapping her pen lightly against a legal pad. Daniel Moore arrived last, his expression already telling me he did not like what was about to happen. "Olivia," Richard said, gesturing toward an empty seat, "we are restructuring how technical leadership is distributed." I sat down without speaking. Ethan smiled at me like this was a friendly exchange. "We are really excited about the new direction," he added. "New direction," that phrase again. Richard continued, "We believe it is important to bring in leadership that reflects future growth and innovation." I remember looking at him directly when I asked, "And what exactly is being replaced?" A small silence followed. Sarah stepped in quickly, as if rehearsed. "Not replaced, more like rebalanced roles. You have built an incredible foundation, Olivia, but scaling requires fresh perspectives." Fresh perspectives. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because I was counting something only I could see. For the first time, I was no longer being excluded quietly. I was being repositioned openly, and that meant the decision had already been made elsewhere. After that meeting, things accelerated. Ethan was assigned to shadow operational workflows, a phrase that sounded harmless but functioned like displacement. He began attending architecture discussions he did not understand, nodding confidently at terms he clearly had not built. Once, I overheard him in the hallway saying, "It is actually simpler than people made it sound." He had no idea what it even was. Meanwhile, my responsibilities were gradually reassigned. First, incident response reviews were removed from my calendar. Then deployment approvals. Then access to core system analytics was quietly restricted. Each change was small enough to look administrative, never aggressive enough to question. At my desk one evening, I opened a dashboard and found half of my permissions gone. A message appeared at the bottom of the screen. Access adjusted per leadership restructuring. I stared at it for a long time before closing the laptop. The strangest part was not anger, it was familiarity. I had seen this pattern before in different forms, in different places, long before corporate systems made it formal. The same slow erasure of contribution, the same rewriting of value. At home that night, I made coffee and sat at my kitchen counter reviewing system logs remotely. Everything still technically functioned, but I noticed something subtle. Latency increased in areas I had previously optimized. Error handling routes were being overridden. Ethan's changes were beginning to propagate deeper than anyone realized. It was not incompetence that worried me. It was speed without comprehension. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. Ethan was already there, standing with a group of engineers, gesturing at a screen like he was explaining something important. When he saw me, he smiled. "Morning, Olivia. I think we are finally streamlining things. It feels much more efficient already." One of the engineers looked uncertain but said nothing. I studied the screen behind him. A deployment map was live, showing real-time system dependencies. Ethan had rerouted a core process without realizing it was tied to 3 critical subsystems. "Did you validate rollback conditions?" I asked calmly. He blinked. "Rollback conditions?" Sarah from HR walked past at that moment and chimed in lightly. "We are encouraging autonomy in decision-making now. Less bottlenecking." Bottlenecking. I repeated the word internally and said nothing out loud. Instead, I turned and walked back to my desk. That afternoon, Daniel Moore found me alone in the operations lab. He closed the door behind him before speaking. "They are moving too fast," he said quietly. "Ethan does not understand half of what you built." I looked at the monitors in front of me. "He does not have to understand it," I replied. "They just have to believe he does." Daniel exhaled slowly. "This system is not modular in the way they think it is. If he keeps changing things without knowing the dependencies, we will start seeing instability." I nodded once. "We already are." That was the first time someone else said it out loud, but it was not the first time I had noticed it. Later that week, I was removed from the primary incident response channel. No explanation was given, just a quiet notification that my access level had been updated. Ethan took over the channel the same day, posting a message that read, "Excited to take this forward with the team." The reactions were positive emojis. I read it twice and closed the window. That evening, I stayed late again. The office was almost empty except for cleaning staff in distant hallways. I pulled up system architecture diagrams layer by layer, tracing every dependency I had built over years. It was all still there, but now fragmented in ways that made it harder to see the full structure at once. That was when I noticed something small but significant. A core authentication pathway had been rerouted to a temporary endpoint controlled by Ethan's access group. Temporary in corporate language often meant permanent until something broke. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. This was no longer about being replaced. It was about what would happen when replacement met reality. As I saved my notes and closed the system, a new notification appeared on my screen. Mandatory Leadership Transition Review scheduled for tomorrow morning. Attendees: Richard Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell, HR Leadership, and myself. No context, no agenda, just presence required. I stared at the message for a long moment, then closed my laptop. Because something in the structure had already started moving, and tomorrow was not going to be another meeting. It was going to be the moment everything either held or began to collapse. The first real fracture did not come from a system failure or a technical mistake. It came from words, carefully chosen words, delivered in the right rooms at the right time until they began to sound like truth. I noticed it on a Wednesday morning when I walked into the office and felt the air shift slightly around conversations that stopped just a little too quickly. People were no longer avoiding me out of caution. They were avoiding me out of belief in something they had been told. At 10 o'clock, I was called into a short meeting with Sarah Bennett from HR. Ethan was already there, sitting comfortably like he had every right to be. Sarah smiled in that practiced corporate way that never reached her eyes. "Olivia, we have been reviewing team alignment feedback," she said, sliding a printed document toward me. "There are concerns about transition resistance." I looked at the paper but did not touch it. "Resistance to what exactly?" I asked. Ethan leaned forward slightly, folding his hands. "I think what Sarah means," he said, "is that some members of the team feel like legacy systems are being protected too aggressively. Legacy systems," he said it like I was part of outdated infrastructure, instead of the person who built the entire operational framework they all depended on daily. Sarah nodded quickly. "It is not personal, Olivia. It is about modernization. We are hearing consistent feedback that you are not fully aligned with the new operational direction. I remember blinking slowly. From who? I asked. A pause, too long to be accidental. Sarah glanced at Ethan before answering. Multiple team members. That was the first lie. Not loud, not dramatic, just structured. Designed to be untraceable. I stood up without raising my voice. Can I see the specific feedback? I asked. Sarah closed the folder gently. We cannot share individual sources due to confidentiality. Ethan smiled faintly. It is not about blame, Olivia. It is about evolution. Evolution. Another word that sounded clean until you realized it was being used to justify removal. I nodded once and left the room. But as I walked back to my desk, I began noticing the second layer of the lie. People were not just avoiding me. They were repeating phrases, almost identical phrases. Transition alignment, new structure efficiency, leadership refresh, words that did not belong to them. They belonged to whoever was feeding them. That evening, I checked internal communication logs from a secondary access channel I still had open. What I saw made everything colder. Messages I had never seen before were circulating among mid-level managers. Emails with my name attached, describing me as resistant to collaborative restructuring and unwilling to support modernization initiatives. I scrolled through them slowly. One message stood out. It was from Ethan to a group of project leads. Olivia has done valuable work historically, but she is emotionally attached to older architecture and may not be the best fit for forward-facing leadership decisions. Emotionally attached. I stared at the screen for a long moment. That was the language of dismissal disguised as professionalism. The next morning, Daniel Moore came to my desk without speaking first. He looked tired, like he had not slept. I need to show you something, he said quietly. We walked to a side conference room. He closed the door and pulled up a network trace on his laptop. This is the deployment log from last night, he said. I watched the screen. These overrides are not coming from Ethan directly, he continued. They are being executed through delegated permissions that trace back to HR restructuring protocols. I frowned slightly. Sarah Bennett? Daniel nodded. Or someone above her. But the key point is this, he said, pointing at a sequence of system calls. These changes are being approved through a chain that bypasses technical validation entirely. I felt something tighten in my chest. So, they are not just replacing me, I said slowly. They are reclassifying the system so I no longer have authority over it. Daniel met my eyes. Yes, and worse, they are documenting your exclusion as part of standard procedure. If anything fails now, it will look like you were never responsible for it in the first place. That was the second layer of betrayal, not just removal, but rewriting history while I was still standing in it. By noon, I was officially removed from all remaining operational channels. My access did not disappear at once. It was stripped in stages, like watching a room slowly empty itself while you are still inside. Ethan posted an announcement shortly after, excited to announce streamlined leadership alignment across technical operations. The message had 35 reactions within minutes. I read every single one. That afternoon, I received an email invitation for a final transition confirmation session. Attendees included Richard Caldwell, Ethan Caldwell, Sarah Bennett, and myself. No agenda, no description, just a calendar block that felt like closure being prepared in advance. I arrived at the conference room at exactly 9:55 the next morning. The city outside was gray, rain pressing softly against the glass walls of the building. Richard was already seated. Ethan was beside him. Sarah sat across from them, organized, composed. Daniel was not there. That told me everything I needed to know about how this meeting had been framed internally. Richard began speaking immediately. Olivia, we appreciate your contributions over the years, he said. Today is about finalizing the transition so we can move forward cleanly. Ethan slid a document toward me. This confirms my appointment as head of technical operations, he said. We appreciate your cooperation during this process. I looked at the paper but did not take it. Cooperation, I repeated quietly. Sarah interjected smoothly. This is standard restructuring protocol, nothing personal. I looked at each of them slowly, one by one. And that was when I realized the final layer of the lie was not just what they were saying, it was what they genuinely believed. They believed I had already been removed from relevance. Richard leaned forward slightly. We will need your access credentials today, he said, for security compliance. I nodded slowly. Of course, I said. And for the first time in that room, Ethan smiled like he had fully won. I reached into my bag and placed my access token on the table. It clicked softly against the surface. The room relaxed almost instantly, like tension had been resolved. Sarah made a note. Ethan leaned back. Richard exhaled as if the hardest part was finally complete. But as I stood up, something shifted in the system logs running silently across my private device. One final synchronization alert appeared on screen. Core dependency threshold reached. System stability at risk. I looked at the message for half a second longer than anyone in that room noticed. Then I closed my laptop. And that was the exact moment everything they believed they had controlled began to fall out of alignment. The first call came 2 hours after I left the conference room. I was still sitting in my car in the underground parking garage, engine off, watching the same notification on my phone repeat itself like it was trying to convince me of something I already understood. "Olivia, can you please call me back immediately?" It was Richard Caldwell. I did not respond. The second call came 5 minutes later. Then another. Then another. By the sixth missed call, the pattern had already changed. It was no longer leadership confidence. It was uncertainty breaking through control. At the same time, my email began to flood. Subject lines stacked one after another. Urgent system instability report. Unexpected latency in core services. Critical deployment rollback required. I opened none of them at first. I simply watched the notifications accumulate like evidence I had already predicted. Then Daniel Moore texted me directly. "Are you seeing this?" it read. I replied only once. Yes. After that, the silence I had been experiencing for weeks reversed direction. Now it was not me being excluded. It was them trying to reach me and failing. By late afternoon, Sarah Bennett from HR left me a voicemail. Her voice was no longer composed. "Olivia, there seems to be some confusion regarding system dependencies. We may need to clarify your previous access permissions." There was a pause in her tone that did not belong in corporate communication. "Please call me back as soon as possible." I listened to it once and deleted it. Then came Ethan Caldwell. His message was shorter, less controlled. "Hey, I think something is wrong with the deployment chain. Can you just check your end and make sure everything is stable?" I stared at the screen for a moment before typing back. "Everything you have access to is functioning exactly as configured." I did not send anything else. That evening, the attempts escalated. Richard called again, this time leaving a longer voicemail. "Olivia, this is not about hierarchy anymore. We are experiencing cascading system failures and we cannot isolate the root cause. I need you to come in and help stabilize operations." His voice had shifted completely. Not authoritative, not procedural. Desperate in a way I had never heard before. I replayed it once, then placed the phone face down on my kitchen counter. Around the same time, my personal email inbox began receiving messages from internal teams I had not spoken to in days. Engineers I once worked alongside were now writing things like, "We are not sure what changed, but multiple services are failing simultaneously." Another said, "Ethan's last deployment might have broken dependency mapping." One message stood out more than the others. It was from a senior infrastructure engineer I had trained personally. "Olivia, I do not know if you are still involved, but we are seeing failures in authentication, routing, and recovery layers all at once. It feels like the system is missing something foundational." Missing something foundational. I read that sentence twice, then closed the laptop. By the next morning, the tone had shifted from confusion to urgency. I was no longer receiving requests. I was receiving admissions of failure. Sarah Bennett called again, her voice tighter now. "We may have underestimated the complexity of the transition," she said carefully. "There are components in the system that are not behaving as documented." I responded calmly. "Then check the documentation," she exhaled sharply. "Olivia, this is not helpful." I paused before answering. "Neither is replacing architecture with assumption." That was the last time she spoke to me directly. After that, everything moved into collective panic. I could see it through indirect channels. Status dashboards I still had partial visibility into showed increasing instability markers. Services that had been stable for years were now cycling between failure and partial recovery. One internal message thread leaked into my view accidentally. Ethan was writing in all caps, "Why is the failover not triggering correctly?" No one responded immediately. Another message followed seconds later. "We need Olivia back online." That sentence sat on my screen longer than anything else that day. Not because it was satisfying, because it was inevitable. I did not respond. That evening, Daniel Moore appeared outside my apartment building. I saw him through the glass lobby doors before I went down. He looked exhausted, like he had been inside a system breaking apart from every direction. "They cannot stabilize it," he said the moment I stepped outside. "We tried everything. Nothing is working the way it should." I crossed my arms. "Because you removed the person who designed how it works," he nodded once. "No argument, no defense, just acceptance. Richard wants you back," he said. "Not as a consultant, as full authority." I looked at him for a long moment. "And Ethan?" I asked. Daniel hesitated. "He does not understand what he is managing anymore." I did not answer immediately, because at that point, the pattern had already completed itself. Every attempt to replace structure with assumption had collapsed into the same result. Dependency without understanding always fails under pressure. That night, I turned my phone off. No more calls. No more emails, no more messages. Just silence. But it was not peace. It was separation. The kind that happens when a system stops recognizing the people who built it. And somewhere inside that silence, I knew they were still trying to fix what they had already broken, not realizing that the absence they were struggling against was not temporary. It was structural. And the moment they finally understood that, nothing about their control would remain the same. The first thing I noticed when everything collapsed was not noise, but absence. No more messages, no more urgent calls, no more escalation emails filling my inbox at 3:00 a.m. The silence that followed was heavier than the chaos before it. It felt like the entire company had reached a point where even trying to reach me had become meaningless. I was sitting at my kitchen table early in the morning, a cup of coffee untouched beside me, when Daniel Moore finally called. I answered this time. There was a long pause on the other end before he spoke. "Olivia," he said quietly, "we lost control of the system." I did not respond immediately. I just listened to the weight behind his voice. He continued. "Everything is cascading. Authentication layers are failing. Routing logic is unstable. Ethan does not know how to stabilize it. Nobody does." I looked out the window while he spoke. The city outside was moving normally. People walking, cars passing, morning life continuing, as if nothing inside a corporate system was unraveling. "Richard is trying to contain it," Daniel added, "but it is not containment anymore. It is dependency failure." That phrase landed differently. Dependency failure, not sabotage, not attack, just absence of something foundational. I took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "Then you already know what happened," I said. Daniel exhaled heavily. "They are asking for you," he replied. "Not requesting, asking." I did not respond right away, because I already knew what that meant. When systems stop responding, people stop negotiating. They start admitting. By noon, I received a message from Richard Caldwell himself, not through email this time, a direct text. "Olivia, I need you to come in. We will restore your full authority immediately. No conditions." I stared at the message for a long time. No conditions. That phrase alone told me everything had already failed beyond repair. I did not reply. Instead, I placed my phone down and sat in silence. The same silence that had followed me through childhood when I was not chosen, through university when I was not acknowledged, and through corporate rooms where my presence was optional until it became necessary. But this silence felt different. This one had weight on the other side of it. That afternoon, Ethan Caldwell appeared in my building lobby. I did not go down to meet him immediately. I watched him through the glass from the upper floor. He looked different now, not confident, not polished, just tired. When I finally came down, he spoke before I even reached him. "I did not know it would break like this," he said quickly. "I thought it was just optimization. I thought the system was more flexible." I studied him for a moment. There was no anger left in me, only clarity. "You did not break the system," I said quietly. "You removed the structure that held it together." He shook his head slightly. "Then fix it," he said. "Just fix it and we can move forward." I looked at him for a long moment. "You still think this is about fixing," I replied. "It is not." His expression changed slightly. "Not understanding yet. Only discomfort." Later that evening, Sarah Bennett called again. Her voice was no longer corporate. It was careful, almost fragile. "Olivia, I need to be honest with you," she said. "We underestimated your role, not your position. Your role in how everything connects." I stayed silent. She continued. "The system does not behave like it was documented. It behaves like it depends on you." That was the first time anyone inside the company said it clearly. Not that I contributed, not that I helped, but that everything depended on me. And now, without me, nothing behaved as expected. That night, I received a final call from Richard Caldwell. I almost did not answer, but I did. His voice was different this time. No authority left in it, just exhaustion. "Olivia," he said slowly, "we are requesting you return as Chief System Architect with full operational authority restored." I closed my eyes briefly. "You removed me," I said, "and then you rewrote me as unnecessary." There was a pause on the line. "We made a mistake," he admitted finally. Those words should have felt like victory, but they did not. Because victory requires struggle still in progress. This was something else. This was aftermath. The next morning, I went into the office for the first time since everything started collapsing. The building felt quieter than I remembered. People moved differently, less certain, more aware of every step. Ethan was already in the main conference room when I arrived. Richard stood beside him. Sarah was there too. No one spoke immediately when I entered. I sat down without being asked. Richard cleared his throat. "We are restoring your authority immediately," he said. "Full access, full control. Effective now." Ethan did not look at me. Sarah avoided eye contact. I nodded once, not in acceptance, in recognition, because what they were restoring was not power. It was dependency acknowledgement. The system had already proven what it needed to function. I stood up slowly and walked toward the glass wall overlooking the city. For the first time in days, I did not feel pressure. I felt distance. Daniel Moore stepped into the room quietly behind me. "It is stabilizing slowly," he said, "but it only holds when your systems are active again." I looked out at the city skyline for a long moment. Everything outside looked normal again, but I knew normal was not the same as stable. "It is not stability," I said quietly. "It is dependence." No one responded, because now they understood the difference. And in that silence, for the first time since it began, I realized something had already shifted beyond repair in the way they saw me. Not as replaceable, not as temporary, but as the thing they could not see until it was gone. And as I stood there, watching the system slowly attempt to rebuild itself around my presence again, I understood that what came next would not be about collapse anymore. It would be about control, returning to its source. After everything stabilized inside the company, something unexpected happened. They did not push me out again. They did not question my presence. Instead, they watched me carefully, like people observing a system they no longer understood but could not afford to lose. I returned to my workspace, but it no longer felt like the same place I had left. The desks were still there, the screens still glowing with dashboards, but the energy had changed. It was quieter, more cautious, like everyone was waiting for something to either prove me right or prove me unnecessary. Richard Caldwell approached me on the second day back. His tone was no longer authoritative. It was careful, almost restrained. "We are restructuring under your guidance," he said. "Full technical autonomy is yours again." I looked at him for a moment and simply replied, "It was always mine. You just stopped recognizing it." He did not respond to that. Ethan was no longer leading anything. He still came into the office, but he no longer spoke in meetings unless spoken to. Once, I caught him standing outside the operations floor, watching engineers move around like he was trying to understand a language he had briefly believed he could speak. He glanced at me and said quietly, "I did not realize how much was underneath everything." I nodded once. "Most people do not," I said, and continued walking. There was no satisfaction in it, only correction. Over the next few weeks, I began rebuilding the system visibility layer by layer, not because it was broken beyond repair, but because it had been misunderstood at its core. I did not change everything. I restored what had been misaligned. I removed what had been incorrectly reassigned. I reestablished dependencies that no one else had realized were critical until they failed. One afternoon, Daniel Moore stopped by my desk with a cup of coffee and placed it beside my keyboard without speaking. After a moment, he said, "It feels like everything is finally breathing again." I kept my eyes on the screen. "It was always breathing," I said. "They just disrupted the rhythm." He nodded slowly. What happens now? He asked. I paused before answering. Now they stop guessing, I said. That evening, I received a message from Sarah Bennett asking if I would consider helping formalize a new internal structure document. It was no longer phrased as instruction, it was phrased as request. I replied with a simple confirmation and no additional words. Because at this point, communication had changed. It was no longer about persuasion or authority. It was about alignment with reality. Outside of work, my life also began to shift in ways I did not expect. For years, I had treated my personal world as secondary to the systems I built. Now, I found myself sitting in quiet restaurants alone without checking my phone every few minutes. I started walking more, sometimes along the river where the city lights reflected on the water in long broken lines. One evening, I received a message from my brother Jason. We had not spoken in months. His message was short. Mom said you are doing something big now. Dad does not really understand it, but he is asking about you. I stared at it for a moment before replying, I am fine. That was all I wrote. Not because there was nothing else to say, but because there was nothing left to explain. The next time I saw Richard Caldwell, it was in a board review session. He looked different now, less like someone trying to direct, and more like someone trying to understand what he had once thought he controlled. After the meeting, he stayed behind and said quietly, We built everything assuming replaceability. That was our mistake. I turned slightly toward him. You did not build it assuming replaceability, I said. You built it, assuming visibility meant importance. He did not respond immediately. Then he nodded. And you proved otherwise. I did not answer that either. Because by then, I was no longer interested in being proven anything. I was focused on ensuring nothing broke again for the wrong reasons. Over time, the system did not just stabilize, it improved, not because of new leadership, but because the structure was finally being respected instead of overridden. Teams began functioning with clarity instead of assumption. Errors decreased not because people worked harder, but because dependencies were finally understood instead of ignored. One evening, Daniel sent me a message that simply read, This is the first time in months everything feels predictable. I looked at it and closed my phone without replying. Because predictability was not the final goal. Sustainability was. And as I sat in my office late that night, watching the system dashboards settle into consistent patterns, I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider before. What I had rebuilt was no longer just recovery, it was foundation. And foundations, once fully recognized, often become the beginning of something far larger than what they were originally built to support. The first time I walked back into the operations floor after everything stabilized, it felt different in a way I could not immediately name. It was not quieter, not louder, not even more organized. It was aware, as if the entire environment had learned something it could not unlearn. Engineers looked up when I entered, not with confusion or indifference, but with recognition. My access badge had been reissued the night before. Black background, silver text, new designation, clearly printed beneath my name, Chief Systems Architect, Olivia Harper. The plastic card felt heavier than before, not physically but symbolically, like it now carried the weight of every decision the company depended on. When I tapped it at the secure entrance, the system responded instantly. No delay, no hesitation, complete authorization restored. One of the junior engineers, a man I had never spoken to before, stood as I passed his station. Good morning, Olivia, he said quickly, almost rehearsed, then added, We have been waiting for your final structural review on the deployment architecture. I stopped for a moment and looked at him. It is not a final review, I said calmly. It is a correction cycle. He nodded immediately, like the distinction mattered more than he expected. At my desk, the environment had changed subtly. My monitors were already logged into full system visibility without manual authentication. Dashboards, dependency maps, real-time deployment flows, everything I had designed but had been denied access to during the transition period now reappeared in complete form. Daniel Moore approached a few minutes later, holding a printed report that looked more like a confession than documentation. Everything is stabilizing faster under your oversight, he said. I did not look up immediately. It was never unstable, I replied. It was unaligned. He nodded slowly. Richard wants you in the executive systems briefing this afternoon. I finally turned to him. Now he wants alignment, I said. Daniel gave a faint, tired smile. Now he understands what alignment means. By midday, the company began reacting differently to my presence. Meetings that previously excluded me now paused when I entered. Conversations that once shifted away from my name now paused mid-sentence and resumed carefully. I did not need to assert authority. The system did it for me. Even Ethan Caldwell, who had been positioned as replacement leadership, now operated at the edge of discussions rather than inside them. I passed him in the hallway near the server access corridor. He hesitated before speaking. "Olivia," he said carefully, "I did not realize how much was dependent on structural continuity." I stopped for a brief moment. "It was always dependent," I said. "You were just never shown where." He nodded slowly, no longer attempting confidence. Later that week, a formal executive restructuring announcement was issued. My title was no longer just technical. It had expanded into Enterprise Systems Authority, full architectural control across all operational layers. A new access level had been created specifically for me because no existing category had been sufficient. When I walked into the board review session that confirmed it, Richard Caldwell stood to greet me. It was the first time I had ever seen him stand in acknowledgement rather than authority. "We are formally recognizing your role as foundational to the company's operational integrity," he said. "Effective immediately." I looked at the document on the table, my name printed at the top, Chief Systems Architect and Enterprise Systems Authority. Below it, a list of systems that now explicitly required my approval for modification. I did not smile. I simply signed. After the meeting, Sarah Bennett approached me in the hallway. Her tone was different now, quieter. "I need to ask something," she said. I waited. "How long have you known the system could not function without you?" I considered the question carefully before answering, long enough not to be surprised when it proved itself. She nodded once, as if accepting something she did not want to admit. That evening, I walked through the office after most people had left. The lights were dimmed automatically, leaving only the glow of system monitors and quiet indicators of stability across multiple screens. For the first time since everything began, there were no emergency alerts, no instability warnings, no dependency failures, just controlled continuity. I stopped near the central operations wall, where live system architecture was displayed in real time. It no longer felt like something I had built and lost. It felt like something that had finally been understood. Daniel joined me a few minutes later, hands in his pockets. "It is strange," he said quietly. "It feels like the company is finally functioning the way it was always supposed to." I looked at the structure on the screen. "It always was," I said. "You just could not see it clearly until now." He did not respond. There was nothing left to correct in the moment. As I left the building that night, I passed Ethan again near the exit. He looked up briefly. "What happens now?" he asked. I paused at the door for a moment before answering. "Now nothing breaks unless it is meant to," I said. And then I stepped outside into the cold Chicago air, where the city lights reflected off wet pavement, and everything that had once been unstable behind me now existed in a controlled present. But even as I walked away from the building, I knew this was not the end of the system. It was the beginning of a structure that would no longer move without being understood first, and somewhere deeper in that realization, the next phase of everything was already forming quietly inside the framework I now fully controlled. The message from Daniel came at exactly 7:43 in the morning, just as I was finishing my first cup of coffee in silence. No subject line, no urgency markers, just a single sentence. "They want you in the executive boardroom today at 10. I stared at the screen for a long moment without replying, not because I was surprised, but because I was already expecting it. When a system finally realizes it cannot function without you, it does not negotiate slowly anymore. It rushes back. I arrived at the headquarters at 9:55. The building felt different again, but this time not because of uncertainty. It felt like anticipation. People were moving slower in the hallways, voices lower, conversations ending abruptly when I passed. I could feel awareness returning to the space I walked through. At the security desk, the guard stood a little straighter than usual as he returned my badge. "Good morning, Miss Harper," he said carefully, as if the title itself had become heavier overnight. I nodded once and walked through without stopping. The elevator ride to the top floor was quiet, except for the soft mechanical hum rising between floors. My reflection in the mirror panel looked unchanged, but everything around it felt like it had shifted its understanding of me. When the doors opened, Richard Caldwell was already standing outside the boardroom. He did not greet me immediately. Instead, he studied me for a moment like someone recalculating a decision that had already been made. "Before we begin," he said carefully, "there is something we need to clarify internally." I looked at him without responding. He continued, "There has been confusion regarding system ownership, architectural dependency, and operational control." The words were chosen carefully, but I could hear what was underneath them. Not confusion, dependency acknowledgement. Ethan Caldwell was standing near the glass wall behind him. He did not smile this time. He looked like someone trying to understand a system he had once believed he could simply inherit. Sarah Bennett stood with a tablet in her hands, not typing, just holding it like it might anchor the situation. Daniel Moore was already inside the room, waiting near the central table. Richard gestured for me to enter. I walked in and took my seat without hesitation. The room fell into a silence that was no longer administrative. It was structural. Richard cleared his throat. "We reviewed the last 72 hours of system performance," he said, "and it has become clear that stabilization only occurs when your architectural layer is active." I nodded slightly. "That is expected," I said calmly. Ethan shifted in his seat. "We did not realize how deeply interconnected everything was," he admitted quietly. "We thought components could be separated without impact." I turned my head slightly toward him. "They can be separated," I said, "but not without consequences." Sarah finally spoke, her voice lower than before. "We need clarity on long-term structure. Who is actually responsible for system continuity?" That question changed the room. Not because it was new, but because it was now unavoidable. I leaned back slightly in my chair and looked at each of them one by one. No urgency. No pressure. Just observation. "You already know the answer," I said. Richard exhaled slowly. "Then we formalize it," he said. Immediately. Daniel looked down at the table for a moment before speaking. "There is something else," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "A dependency audit completed last night shows that multiple core systems were never fully transferred during the restructuring." Ethan frowned. "That is not possible," he said quickly. Daniel shook his head slightly. "It is possible when the documentation never reflected the actual architecture." Silence returned to the room, heavier this time. Richard turned toward me. "Olivia," he said carefully, "we need confirmation. Did you intentionally retain control over any critical systems during transition?" I did not answer immediately, because this was the moment they had been approaching without understanding it. Not sabotage, not resistance, truth. I looked at the glass wall behind them, at the city beyond, moving normally, unaware of the conversation that was about to redefine everything they believed about control. "I did not retain anything," I said quietly. "I never transferred what you never asked to understand." Ethan's expression changed slightly. Not anger, not defense. Realization forming too late to reverse. Sarah looked down at her tablet, as if hoping for a different report to appear. Richard stepped closer to the table. "Are you saying," he said slowly, "that the system has been operating on undocumented architecture this entire time?" I met his eyes directly. "I am saying the system has always operated on architecture you never mapped." The words hung in the room without response. Daniel looked at me briefly, then at the others. "If that is true," he said quietly, "then removing her from control never actually removed control." I stood up slowly at that point, not in anger, not in victory, but in recognition that the final alignment had reached its edge. The room did not move. No one spoke, because in that moment, they were all understanding the same thing at the same time, without needing it explained further. I looked at Richard once more before turning slightly toward the door. "You did not replace me," I said calmly. "You only discovered what happens when the foundation is not where you assumed it was." I took one step toward the exit. Behind me, I heard Richard speak my name, but I did not turn around. Because at that exact second, before any resolution, before any correction, before any system could stabilize into understanding, they were finally about to hear the part they had never prepared for. The moment I stepped into the hallway outside the boardroom, I could feel the shift before anyone spoke. It was not noise, not movement, but recognition changing shape. Behind the glass walls, I saw them still seated at the table, still frozen in the weight of what had just been said. But something had already broken open in the way they looked at me now. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply walked forward at a steady pace, every step echoing in a space that suddenly felt smaller than it used to. When I reached the center of the room again, I stopped just inside the doorway. No one spoke immediately. Richard Caldwell was the first to break the silence, but even his voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Olivia," he said carefully, "we need to understand this clearly." I looked at him calmly. "You already do," I replied. Ethan shifted in his chair, his hands resting on the table but no longer confident. "Are you saying," he asked slowly, "that everything we have been operating on was dependent on systems we did not control?" I turned slightly toward him. "You were never meant to control it," I said. "You were meant to use it." That sentence landed heavier than anything that had been said before. Sarah Bennett finally looked up from her tablet. "Then what exactly are we operating on?" she asked. I paused for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because the answer had always been too simple for them to accept. "You are operating on a structure that was never fully documented, because it was never designed to be separated into parts," I said quietly. Daniel Moore leaned forward slightly. "So, every deployment, every system update, every operational change," he said slowly, "has been running through your architecture layer." I nodded once. "Yes." Richard stood up slowly from his chair. For the first time since I had known him, he did not look like a CEO. He looked like someone realizing the limits of what authority can actually control. "We built this company on modular independence," he said, almost to himself. I shook my head slightly. "You built it on continuity. You did not map," I corrected. Ethan's voice was quieter now. "Then why did you let us remove you from control?" he asked. I met his eyes directly. "Because removing me did not remove the system," I said. "It only revealed what happens when people assume ownership over something they never understood." The room went silent again, but this time it was different. It was not tension. It was realization settling in too late to be undone. Sarah spoke softly, almost to herself. "Then the failures last week? The instability? That was not malfunction," I answered without emotion. "That was misalignment." Richard walked slowly toward the glass wall, looking out at the city below as if trying to find something stable outside the room that no longer existed inside it. "We thought we were modernizing," he said. "We thought we were improving efficiency." I stepped forward slightly, stopping near the table. "You were changing the surface," I said, "not the structure." Daniel closed his laptop gently. "This means every system we thought was independent is actually interlinked at a deeper level than we understood," he said. I nodded again. "Yes." Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, no longer speaking with confidence, only reflection. "So what happens now?" he asked. I looked around the room slowly, at each of them. Not as a challenge, but as confirmation. "Now you decide whether you want control," I said, "or understanding." That sentence stayed in the air longer than anything else. No one responded immediately, because there was nothing to argue against anymore. Richard finally turned back toward me. His voice was lower now, almost measured carefully. "What do you need from us to stabilize everything fully?" he asked. I did not answer immediately, because this was the first time they had asked the right question, but for reasons they still did not fully understand. I walked slowly toward the table and placed my hand lightly on the edge of it. "Nothing you can give," I said. "Only something you have to accept." Sarah frowned slightly. "And what is that?" she asked. I looked at her directly. "That the system was never yours to replace," I said. "It was only yours to operate within." A long silence followed. No interruption, no correction. Just understanding, forming slowly in real time across every face in the room. Then my phone vibrated once in my pocket. A system alert I had been expecting but had not yet seen. I glanced at it briefly. The message was simple, but its implication was not. Core architecture reintegration complete. All systems stabilized under original structural authority. I turned the screen off without showing anyone. When I looked up again, I saw it in their expressions. Not panic anymore. Not confusion. Something closer to recognition that could not be reversed. And in that moment, as they all finally understood what had been sitting beneath every decision they made without them ever seeing it clearly, the silence that followed was not just emotional. It was the sound of everything they thought they controlled finally changing hands. After the words were spoken in that boardroom, nothing returned to how it had been before. Not for them. Not for me. The system had already settled into its new alignment, but the human side of it was still catching up, still reacting in waves that had not yet found stability. I could see it in the way they moved around the office afterward, not directly confronting me, but recalculating every interaction they had ever had with me. Richard Caldwell called another executive session within the hour. I was not invited, not because I was excluded, but because there was nothing left to decide without acknowledging what had already been decided. Still, I could hear fragments of conversation through open channels, voices lowered but not controlled. "We cannot function without her oversight," one executive said. "Then we were never functioning independently," another responded. At my desk, I did not celebrate. I did not react. I simply continued reviewing system performance as if nothing emotional had changed, because technically, nothing in the structure itself required emotion to operate. Daniel Moore came by mid-afternoon and stood beside my workstation for a moment before speaking. "They are trying to understand how to formalize this," he said. "Ownership, authority, governance structure." I looked at him briefly. "They are trying to rename dependence," I replied. He nodded slowly. "Richard is requesting a one-on-one meeting with you." I did not answer immediately. After a few seconds, I said, "Schedule it." The meeting took place in a smaller conference room this time. No glass walls, no audience, just the two of us, and a printed stack of system architecture reports that suddenly felt inadequate to describe reality. Richard Caldwell looked older than he had a few days earlier. Not physically, but in the way people look when certainty has been replaced with awareness they did not prepare for. He placed his hands on the table and spoke first. "We need to redefine your role completely," he said. I waited. He continued, "Not as an employee, not as a department head, as the central authority of system continuity." I nodded once. "You already did," I said. He shook his head slightly. "We attempted decentralization," he admitted. "It failed." I looked at him directly. "It did not fail," I said. "It revealed itself." There was a long pause after that, not uncomfortable, just heavy with the recognition that language was no longer sufficient to disguise structure. Ethan Caldwell had been placed outside the formal hierarchy by then. Not removed, but repositioned into a non-operational advisory role. I saw him briefly in the hallway later that day. He stopped when he saw me. "I did not realize what I was stepping into," he said quietly. I replied without stopping. "You were not stepping into it, you were stepping over it." That was the last direct exchange between us. After that, the company changed in ways that were not visible on charts, but were immediately felt in behavior. Meetings began with acknowledgement of system dependencies before agendas. Change requests required architectural consultation before approval. My name appeared on documentation not as contributor, but as reference point. Still, something inside the organization resisted settling completely. Not rebellion, but discomfort. The realization that control had always been conditional on understanding created a kind of institutional hesitation. One afternoon, Sarah Bennett approached my desk with a folder in her hands. She placed it down gently before speaking. "We are formalizing a new governance framework," she said, "and we need your confirmation on final authority boundaries." I opened the folder and looked at the documents. They were precise, structured, careful, but still incomplete in the way all systems are when they try to define something they do not fully comprehend. I closed it again and said, "Authority does not need boundaries. It needs recognition." She did not respond immediately. Then she nodded once and left. That evening, Richard asked me to stay after most of the office had cleared. The building was quieter than it had been in weeks, as if it too had finally adjusted to the new structure. We stood near the central operations display, watching real-time system flow stabilize across all modules. "Do you ever feel like this should have been seen earlier?" he asked. I considered the question. "It was seen," I said. "It was just not understood." He nodded slowly. "And now?" he asked. I looked at the screen for a long moment before answering. "Now it continues," I said. Correctly this time. There was no celebration, no relief, only equilibrium. But even as I prepared to leave the building that night, I noticed something subtle in the way people looked at me as I walked through the corridor. Not fear, not admiration, something closer to recalibrated awareness. The understanding that what had once been treated as replaceable had never been replaceable at all. As I stepped outside into the cold Chicago air, my phone remained silent for the first time in days. No alerts, No escalations. No requests for intervention. Just quiet stability behind me and an uncertain new order forming in the space I had just redefined. But even as I walked away from the building, I could feel it lingering behind me, not resolved, not finished, just suspended in a state where everyone now understood the truth but had not yet decided what to do with it. The days after everything settled did not feel like a victory. They felt like silence after a storm that had already torn through everything unnecessary. Caldwell Systems did not collapse, and it did not explode into chaos either. Instead, it stabilized under a structure that finally matched reality instead of assumption. For the first time in years, I was not being pulled in 5 directions at once just to keep invisible systems alive. I arrived at work each morning and saw something unfamiliar on every screen. Clarity. No emergency alerts flashing in red, no cascading failures waiting behind hidden dependencies, just controlled, predictable function. People no longer rushed past me with uncertainty in their eyes. They slowed down. They asked questions differently now, not to challenge, but to understand. Even Richard Caldwell changed in ways that were subtle but undeniable. He no longer spoke about leadership as control. He spoke about alignment. One afternoon, he stood beside me near the operations floor window and said quietly, "I spent years thinking structure was something you managed. I did not realize it was something you had to respect." I did not respond immediately. I watched the city below, traffic moving in steady patterns, unaware of the systems above it that mirrored its order. "Most people do not see systems until they break," I said finally. He nodded once. "And most people rebuild them wrong," he replied. Ethan Caldwell left the company quietly 2 weeks later. There was no announcement, no confrontation, just a resignation email that referenced pursuing a better understanding of organizational dynamics. I read it once and closed it, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left in it that required emotional weight. Sarah Bennett shifted into a compliance restructuring role, and Daniel Moore stayed in technical leadership, but now with a level of consultation he had never had before. The company was no longer operating in chaos, but it was no longer operating under illusion either. It was operating under truth. And truth, I learned, does not feel dramatic. It feels stable. Outside of work, my life began to expand in ways I had not made space for before. I started eating meals without checking system logs on my phone. I started walking along the Chicago River at night without thinking about deployment cycles or dependency chains. One evening, I received a message from my mother. It was short. "We heard about your promotion. Your father is proud of you." I stared at it for a long moment. Not because it mattered anymore, but because I realized it no longer defined anything. I simply replied, "I am fine." That was enough. There was no need to rebuild old conversations in places where they had never been understood. One weekend, I visited Seattle for the first time in years. I stood outside the old house where I grew up. The paint was newer, the fence slightly different, but the feeling was the same. I did not go inside. I just stood there for a while and realized something important. I had spent most of my life trying to be seen in places that were never built to recognize me, and now I no longer needed them to. On the flight back to Chicago, I sat by the window and watched clouds shift beneath the wings of the plane. For the first time, I was not thinking about what could fail. I was thinking about what could continue. Not perfectly, not permanently, but correctly. That was when I understood the real change had never been about the company or the system or even the people who tried to replace what they did not understand. It had been about me learning the difference between being used and being valued, between being invisible and being essential, between being present and being recognized. When I returned to the office the next morning, everything was already running smoothly. My desk had a small updated plaque placed quietly beside my monitor, Chief Systems Architect. No announcement had been made. No ceremony had been held. It simply existed, as if it had always belonged there. I picked it up for a moment, turned it in my hand, and set it back down. Not because it defined me, but because I finally understood I had never needed it to. Later that evening, as I left the building, Daniel walked beside me for a few steps. "It feels different now," he said. I nodded slightly. "It is not different," I replied. "It is just honest." We stopped at the entrance. He hesitated before speaking again. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they never tried to replace you?" I looked out at the city lights for a moment before answering. "No," I said. because then I would still be waiting to be understood instead of being free. That night, I sat alone in my apartment and placed my phone on the table. No alerts, no system requests, no dependency checks, just stillness. And in that stillness, I realized something simple but final. I was no longer the foundation people ignored until it broke. I was the structure they finally learned to respect. Olivia Harper, age 34. And the lesson I want to leave with you is this. Never confuse being overlooked with being unimportant, because the truth of your value does not change just because others fail to see it. And if you are listening to this feeling unseen, misunderstood, or underestimated, I want you to know something quietly powerful. Sometimes the world does not recognize you, not because you are small, but because you are holding everything together without anyone noticing. And when that moment comes, when everything finally aligns with truth, you do not need to prove your worth. You simply stand in it. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it spoke to you in any way, take a moment to like, share, or subscribe, not for the algorithm, but so that more people who feel invisible can find something that reminds them they are not alone. And if you are still here, I want you to breathe for a second and just remember that being underestimated is not the end of your story. Sometimes it is the beginning of your clarity. If you want to continue these journeys of quiet strength and hidden truth, there are more stories waiting for you in the playlist right here, each one carrying its own path from silence to understanding. And I will see you in the next one.